All right, so this is like side project 335, Papa Spanky's 68 Ford. It's got, and this is a common problem with carburetors built like this, Edelbrocks, Motorcraft, the Holley without fuel bowls. They all have Welch plugs under the carburetor, and they leak. So, you know, they all boast about, you know, not having gaskets below the fuel level, but the Welch plugs are actually worse than gaskets. So this thing's got a standard Ford 2-barrel. It's leaking down. After it sets for a week or so, the fuel bowl's dry. And I done a little preliminary test, and I couldn't find a leak, so we got it off and, you know, just went through the whole carburetor. And this one is a little different than I've seen before. It doesn't have the Welch plugs up under the bottom like normal Ford 2-barrels. So I'm a little bit scratching my head on where the leak's at, but it's definitely leaking. It runs slick as a button. If you crank it up every 2 or 3 days, it's golden. But if you let it sit for a week, week and a half, all the fuel's gone. And so we got to figure that out. We got a couple other little projects to do on it. So hang with us, and I'm going to show you some. We're going to take the lid off of this thing and run it with it on the car so you can see the fuel level and the fuel coming in and all that stuff. So hang loose. All right, so the way these are made, this carburetor will actually run with the top off of it. So you can see in the bowl, you can see the jets, you can see the whole deal. You could probably, I'm trying to think, you couldn't do it on an Edelbrock because the fuel comes in the top of the carburetor. So I guess if you if you had the carburetor full, you could run it with the lid off, but you couldn't see the fuel coming in. But luckily the fuel is down low. The Holley version, you couldn't run it with the lid off either because it's got the same problem as the Edelbrock with the fuel coming in the top plate. So that makes it where that don't work out. But on these you can. So just for giggles, to make sure I don't see nothing stupid going on, I'm gonna pop the lid off and we're gonna run it and just see if we see anything weird. And then if we don't, I'm gonna pull this carburetor back off and we're gonna fill it up with fuel, and we're gonna stand it up on some jack stands where we can see the bottom of it and just see if we can visually see a leak. This carburetor has two, in the base plate going in horizontally, it has 2 Welch plugs, and they're good. There's no fuel on the outside, but there's no Welch plugs that I can see under the bottom. So I just can't imagine where it could be leaking, but obviously leaking somewhere, and it's a pretty good size leak. So hang on, and I'm gonna just pop this lid off, and then I'll bring you back when we get the lid off. All right, so we got the lid off, and I had to make a little splash guard because the needle and seat's right there, so it's splashing a little bit. I mean, I don't see anything obvious. So when I originally done the carburetor, the way compared to a Holley, so the booster system and the emulsion circuit is all, and the accelerator nozzles are all built into one deal. And they have Welch plugs on top here where they drilled all the orifices. So these Welch plugs, when I pressure tested them, these Welch plugs were leaking. So we just cleaned them good and epoxied them over the top, because if the Welch plug is leaking, then it's robbing the signal to the booster to pull the fuel over through the emulsion tubes. So that's a problem, because it'll make it lean and it can make it have a stumble, and it actually did. It stumbled really bad. That we fixed that part, and then But again, we still got this fuel leak deal. So it's just sitting here. I don't see nothing crazy going on. I mean, obviously the leak is not that fast, but I'm gonna crank it up and just let you see it run with no top. Hopefully from there you can see the fuel and the float and all. But you know, I mean, it runs fine. Like I say, it just leaks down. So crank it up, Jake. So the fuel level never gets high. You know, nothing's leaking over at the booster. The throttle blades aren't wet. You know, I don't see any signs of anything normal. So it's got to be leaking some kind of way through the bottom, but I just don't see it. I've seen some stuff. I mean, not these, but I've seen some like some old Chevrolets. They'll actually heat soak back through the carburetor and raise the fuel level, and then it'll start a siphoning effect and actually pull all the fuel out of the bowl into the motor. And normally how we fix that is put like a phenolic spacer under the carburetor, and usually it cures it right up. So, but it's just all that heat just going right into the carburetor. How it didn't do it 60 years ago is mind-boggling. It's got to be just the fuel. The specific gravity of the fuel and how it takes heat and swells up is the only thing I can come up with. But like I say, I've let it run like this for a good while, and I mean, it looks perfect. I don't see no issue. So so we're gonna rip this thing off and get it on up on some jack stands and see if we can see where this fuel's going. So I found something interesting. We pulled this carburetor off full of fuel at like 12 o'clock. So I brought it in here and I set it up on the granite surface plate, just, you know, so I could see if I could see it dripping fuel, right? I noticed something when it was on the car running, and I noticed the same thing here. And normally you don't get to see the float with the carburetor running or with it full of fuel, into fuel. The whole top of the float kept having fuel on top of the float, and I can see like some little places, I don't know what you want to call them, they're not really cracks but more like little divots in the float. And this is one of those composite type brick floats. I don't know what you actually call it. It's not a brass or a plastic, you know, float, and it kept having fuel on top of the float. And I noticed as I watched it, you could see the fuel kind of moving on top of the float. And I'm just like, man, that don't make no sense. So when I come back out here, it's like 2.5 hours later. So I come back out here and probably the fuel level is down, I don't know, a ½ inch probably. So just in 2.5 hours, the fuel level has went down a ½ inch, which is crazy. And there's not a drip on the table. There's not a drip on the table. The bottom of the carburetor's bone dry. But what I noticed, and what may be going on, is this float is compromised and the fuel is wicking up through the float, and then the thin film on the top is evaporating. It's the only thing I can come up with, because what I did, so the whole time it's sitting in the fuel, the top of the float is wet. I mean, it's like got a puddle on it wet. So I popped the float out of the carburetor and bring it over here and set it in the tray, and the fuel runs out off whatever you want to say, of this float into the bowl, and it evaporates. And now the float is bone dry. There's no more fuel sitting on top of the float. So I believe what's happening is it's wicking that fuel. This float's bad, and it's wicking that fuel up through the float and into, you know, onto the top. And it's just so thin that it can evaporate easy. That's the only thing that makes any sense to me, because they're again, and I'll show them to you. And I don't think I got, hang on, let me see if I got an Edelbrock in here. So I'll get, I don't have one in here. They probably down in the other shop. I got a bunch of old used carburetors and stuff. I'll get Andrew to put a picture up here. But you can see, like, here's the bottom of an Edelbrock, and you can see all of these Welch plugs. And these Welch plugs are where they drilled fuel passages to intersect, to go from, you know, the jet up to the booster and so on and so forth. And so fuel is sitting on them Welch plugs all the time. You know, over time, just hot and cold, they start leaking. And these Motorcraft 2 barrels, and I'll put, this one doesn't have them. And this is the first one I've ever seen that doesn't have Welch plugs in the bottom of it. And I'll see if we can find a picture of one with Welch plugs in the bottom. And normally that's the issue. Quadrajets have that problem. Edelbrocks have that problem. Motorcraft carburetors have that problem. The Holley two-piece bodies have that problem. And we see it all the time with the Welch plugs leaking. And so normally it's either replace the Welch plugs and or epoxy them and replace them. Sometimes you can just epoxy over them and it's fine. Sometimes we have to knock them out, and I'll epoxy the bore diameter and then put a new plug in it, and it's just like double insurance. But I felt confident that that was going to be the problem on this carburetor. But again, it only has, I don't know if you can, yeah. So right beside the idle mixture screws, it's got two brass Welch plugs. Well, actually, these ain't even Welch plugs. They're actually like little cut plugs, like freeze plugs. So, but they're dry as a bone, right? There's no issue. So when I seen all that, I'm like, man, you know, I just couldn't figure out what was going on. And now I'm 99% sure that it's going to be the float. But I just, you know, I hate wasting money. I mean, he said, you know, we could go ahead and put an intake and just buy a new Holley and put on it. But I hate problems that I can't fix. It just kills me. So when I run into something, and I mean, I know that I know how a carburetor works, and I'm just like, how is the fuel going away? I mean, if it ain't dripping on the table, then there ain't but one place else it can go, and that's into the atmosphere. And so, like I say, I think this float wicking that fuel up and just sitting on the top just makes it enough to evaporate. And like I say, if you crank it every day, it'll crank, no problem. And if you crank it every 2 or 3 days, it'll crank, no problem. But if you let it sit for a week, the carburetor's bone dry. I mean, it's absolutely bone dry. So I hope that we're gonna put a float in it, and that's gonna rectify this situation. But once I get it, I'll have to order a float. Once I get a float, we'll make sure that it don't do that same wicking deal with fuel on top of it. That's a little interesting. And then I'll bring you back and, you know, show you what did it fix it or did it not fix it, or, you know, we'll figure it out. But I thought that, you know, that would be interesting for you. But I'll get all this stuff ordered. We'll probably just make this one episode. I'm gonna get this float ordered. We're gonna get it, put it in, and see if that rectifies it, and then we'll have a part 2 of this, and we'll know whether we fixed it or not. Thanks so much. You need anything, check out the website, powellmachininc.com. We got a bunch of new t-shirts in. See you on the next one.